This is the X-Zone Broadcast Network, broadcasting worldwide on broadcast affiliates and satellite program providers, including CNN Broadcast Network, Sirius Satellite Network, Star Media, Good News Radio Network, Angel Broadcast Network, Wiki Broadcast Network, and WPBN TV. For more information on the X-Zone Broadcast Network, visit us at www.xzbn.net.
This is A Different Perspective with Kevin Randle. A retired U.S. Lieutenant Colonel, Kevin Randle has been studying UFOs for nearly 50 years. Kevin has investigated some of the most famous UFO cases in the world and has been consulted for dozens of documentaries about UFOs. Considered one of the leading experts into the Roswell UFO crash of 1947, Kevin has written more than 25 books about UFOs, including the recently published Roswell in the 21st Century. Now, here's the host of A Different Perspective, Kevin Randle.
Good evening. I am, in fact, Kevin Randle, and this is A Different Perspective. We are broadcasting high atop the Baker Hotel in beautiful downtown Midland. I don't know why I said that. I just made that up for some reason. I just thought it would give a sense of travel to the show. I don't know. Anyway, I am joined today by David Booher, who has written a book called No Return, a UFO Abduction or Covert Operation. And he sent me a very short biography, which tells me he has been fascinated by the unexplained for much of his life. He lives in southern Wisconsin, or as we sometimes say, Wisconsin. Anyway, David, welcome to the program.
Oh, thanks, Kevin. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
As I say, your bio you sent was a tad bit thin. Can you give me a little bit more information about who you are, your background, schooling, military service, things like that?
Sure. I don't really have anything that prepared me to be a writer in my life. Other than just living. I've done a lot of different things. I did orthopedic massage for about 16 or 17 years. I've done carpentry and landscaping and just lots of different things, wildland restoration. But I've always had an interest in things of this nature. And
this nature being UFOs and the like.
Yeah, UFOs, paranormal stuff, the unexplained, as we call it.
Do you have any military service at all?
No, I don't. And actually, that's one reason I look forward to having this conversation with you, because I think you could illuminate certain aspects of the story that only someone with a lot of military experience probably could.
Well, that was why I asked specifically about military experience, because as I read your book, I saw some analysis that didn't strike me as completely authentic based on my reading of other military records and my own experience like that. And I thought we could touch on that when we get into the conversation about the book, which we will do very shortly. College at all?
I've had a little college, but it's I've taken a different track in life. Let's put it that way.
Well, I mean, college isn't important. I think that college teaches you some things that are valuable to research, which is how to look stuff up in libraries and formulate things of that nature. But it's really not that necessary to many occupations. And I think practical experience is sometimes much more important than sitting in a classroom. And the classroom sometimes sets things up that are completely different. I guess the best example, and I'm just going off on a tangent here for some reason, when I went to flight school with the U.S. Army, we were being trained by pilots who'd come back from Vietnam before our going over to Vietnam. And we were taught certain things and certain ways to do that, because that's the way things were done in the Army in Vietnam. When I got there, I learned that things that we would learn that they were supposedly doing, they weren't doing. So it's just, you kind of evolved in your, I guess, education of the flying experience in Vietnam that wasn't quite as accurate as you've been led to believe it might be in flight school. So I thought, that's kind of an important thing. But looking at a case and going out and investigating it firsthand, talking to the main participant, the main witness, is an important thing to do, which is what you've done with your book. I'm kind of rambling on here because we're getting close to the break, and I wanted to save all the real questions about the book until we got past our first break here. The book is called No Return. It's a UFO abduction or covert operation, and it deals with a case that took place back in 1959 and a guy named who was called Gerry Irwin. We'll get into the details here in a moment. As I often say when we're doing this program, I always put up more information about it, or try to, at www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com. So people who have an interest in this specific case or other information can find out where to go to get it. And I always want to mention Roswell in the 21st Century, which I think of as a dispassionate look at the Roswell case as it is seen today. We will be back right after these words with David Booher and he'll talk about his book, No Return, after these messages. So stick around.
This is the X-Zone Broadcast Network, broadcasting worldwide on broadcast affiliates and satellite program providers, including CNN Broadcast Network, Sirius Satellite Network, Star Media, Good News Radio Network, Angel Broadcast Network, Wiki Broadcast Network, and WPBN TV. For more information on the X-Zone Broadcast Network, visit us at www.xzbn.net.
Did you know that when you're on the road with limited data or Wi-Fi, you can still listen to the X-Zone Radio Show with Rob McConnell, The Science of Magic with Gwilda Wiyaka, X-1, Dimension X, Space Patrol, and every minute of the X-Zone Broadcast Network by calling 213-401-0080, courtesy of Audio Now. No smartphone, app, or internet needed. It saves your data plan and it's free if you have unlimited minutes. Call 213-401-0080 to listen on any phone, anytime, anywhere. Remember 213-401-0080 for the best of the paranormal, parapsychology, and sci-fi radio programming anywhere, 24/7, 365.
I am joined by David Booher, who's written the book, as I keep mentioning, No Return. An interesting book that came from Anomalous Books, for those of you who are interested in that sort of thing. I think the first thing we need to do, David, is find out exactly what the book is about. What is the core of this book? What's the story behind it?
Okay, this is a excuse me. This is a case that dates back to 1959. Excuse me. Basically, it's a story of a young soldier who was returning back to his base after a 30-day leave, and he was driving through Utah when he saw a glowing object descending across the highway. And it was strange enough that he stopped the car and got out to watch as it came down. It was a pretty quiet highway. He was the only one there at that time. Then he saw it go below a ridge, and it seemed to crash because he saw the light flare up and then die down, although he didn't hear any sound at all, but he thought it was pretty close by. So not knowing what it was, he decided to prepare for the worst and assume it was potentially a plane crash. So he wrote a note to leave on his vehicle, asking any passerby to notify the police of a possible plane crash. And then he prepared to go off and investigate. At the last minute, he decided that he needed to actually get people to stop and look for the note. So he wrote "stop" on the side of his car with shoe polish and put his blinkers on.
And even though it's irrelevant, was it black shoe polish? Because I always had a vision of it being white shoe polish when I read this case the first time. But thinking military is probably black shoe polish? Or do we even know?
We don't know. He didn't remember that detail, but
so
anyway.
he's written a note on the side of the car to stop. He's left a note under the windshield wiper, or
oh yeah, he left a note on his steering wheel.
On the steering wheel, and then he takes off over the landscape to find this, what he believes to be a plane crash.
Yeah, apparently this is late winter now, and it's at night. He's got to trudge through apparently a foot of snow to get up to the ridge top. And he hasn't gotten very far though when everything goes black. And the next thing he knows, he's waking up in a hospital in Cedar City, Utah, with no memory of what happened in between.
The sheriff is there. The sheriff has stopped by. They found his car. He's obviously been found somewhere and taken to the hospital. Do we know how that happened?
Yes, he gets the full story from the sheriff. He was somebody did stop. It was the Fish and Game radioed into the sheriff in Cedar City, and he organized a search party. And when they found, it was probably an hour later that Gerry was found. The name of this man is Gerry Irwin. Gerry was found at the top of the ridge, about a quarter mile, some accounts say a mile from his vehicle.
He'd only been out there about an hour or so, you say? Did I get that right?
That was the best estimate.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so this Fish and Game agent stops at the car, finds the note, calls the sheriff's department, and the sheriff organizes a search. They go out and find him within an hour and transport him to the hospital.
Yeah. By the time it was all said and done, though, it was about midnight that he arrived at the hospital. So there was it must have taken some time to get him down off the hilltop and get him into the ambulance and take care of him.
Okay, so we get him to the hospital. He is unconscious. He's there for what, a day or two before he regains consciousness or comes to?
Well, this is interesting. It was 24 hours before he gained consciousness or regained consciousness. And that's one of the big question marks, is why was he out for so long? They could find no sign of injury.
Okay, so he's in the hospital. They obviously contact the military authorities at Fort Bliss. That's where he was heading, Fort Bliss in El Paso, Texas, and alert them that they found one of their soldiers injured in the snow and brought him to Cedar City. What happens from that point?
Yeah, after they kept him for a few days in Cedar City for observation, he was flown back to his base at Fort Bliss, Texas. And there they kept him in the psychiatric ward at William Beaumont Hospital for another 3 or 4 days to keep keep a watch on him, test him to make sure there's nothing physically wrong with him. And after that, they gave him a clean bill of health and released him back to duty.
Wasn't he concerned about the plane crash though? Didn't he ask the sheriff there in Cedar City and other people what had happened? Were there any survivors? Were there any casualties?
Yeah, as soon as he regained consciousness, his first words were there any survivors? Obviously, that was foremost in his mind. And the sheriff was eager to talk to him for that reason, to get any further details he could offer, because they had searched for a crash when they were looking for him, and they also did an aerial search the following day, and there was no sign of any plane crash. Okay,
so there's no plane crash. He's been unconscious for 24 hours. He gets back to his base at El Paso. They keep him in the hospital. He's got a clean bill of health. They send him out. How do we get to the UFO aspect?
Well, it actually was an unidentified object. He didn't know what it was. It was actually quite strange looking, but having no way to identify it, he just basically had to prepare for what he did know about, which was planes. He didn't think it was a meteor. And obviously, if it could be a plane crash, he decided that he better see what he could do about it. But he was never sure it was a plane crash. He just didn't know what it was. And the description he ended up actually giving to the sheriff, we have a pretty good idea of that because of a document, a letter that the sheriff later sent to a UFO researcher a few weeks later.
Did the sheriff contact the Lorenzens, and the Lorenzens would be the UFO researchers, I assume?
Well, they were the ones that investigated Gerry's case. The founders of APRO, Jim and Coral Lorenzen. However, I don't know if they were ever in contact with the sheriff. I think they were. They don't actually quote him, but the letter that I located was a letter from Sheriff Otto Fife to C.H. Mark, who I had not heard of before, but in that letter he gives Gerry's testimony of what his experience was, and then also some details about the actual rescue effort.
Did he investigate the case at all?
I think his investigation was solely focused on a possible crash, and when he was satisfied there was no crash, I don't think he pursued it any further. But okay, in the description that he offered, or that he remembered from what Gerry told him, was that it was a large, brilliant object, that he could not determine the shape of it because of the bright rays shooting out from it.
Okay, so we've got him back at base. He's I think private first class, which is a fairly low-ranking enlisted man. Probably hasn't been in the service much more than a year or so. He's assigned to a company. He's released from the hospital, goes back to the company. Any fallout from him apparently returning from leave late, because he clearly wouldn't have got back on time if he was in the hospital for a couple of days. Any fallout from that, or retribution for that?
At the time, no. For that incident, there were no disciplinary actions taken. And I just want to offer a slight correction. Although he's often referred to as PFC Irwin, at the time of this incident, he was SP4. He was a Nike missile technician.
He was a Spec 4, which is still a very low-ranking enlisted man. It's one grade up from a PFC.
Right.
He was an E4 in essence. which is an enlisted grade. So he's back at the company. How did the Lorenzens get involved in this thing? Do you have a clue?
I think that they saw the media reports, and their headquarters, which was their home in Alamogordo, New Mexico, was only, I think, about 80 miles from El Paso, where Gerry was stationed.
I would have said 90 miles, but that's okay. So there were reports in the newspaper about his adventure.
Yes, there was a wave of reports that was carried on AP, and there were a number of independent reports as well. Over about 4 days, there were a number of stories that were being published.
So clearly the Lorenzens clearly the Lorenzens did hear about it. So they went to El Paso to meet with Gerry at his at the Fort Bliss.
Yeah, the incident occurred on February 20th, and there was already an article in the April Bulletin for the March edition. So they were on it fairly rapidly.
And they go to El Paso. El Paso, and they actually interview him in person, correct?
I think the first interview was by phone, and they later met him in person. So
they've gone to El Paso to talk to him about what he'd seen and what his experiences are. So we've got and I'm going to have to wrap up here because we're getting close to the break here. But we've got an object seen in the sky. He thinks it's some kind of a plane crash. He attempts to go out to find it. He passes out. He's found, taken to the hospital. He eventually gets to Fort Bliss. No problems from his company commander or anything like that, because he's legitimately been ill and in the hospital. The UFO report gets out over the air. The Lorenzens go to El Paso to chat with him. We'll get back to that here in just a moment when we come back. As I say, take a look at www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com and take a look at xzbn.net for some of the other fine programs on the X Zone Broadcast Network. We will be back right after this, so stick around.
This is the X Zone Broadcast Network, broadcasting worldwide on broadcast affiliates and satellite program providers, including CNN Broadcast Network, Sirius Satellite Network, Star Media, Good News Radio Network, Angel Broadcast Network, Wiki Broadcast Network, and WPBN TV. For more information on the X Zone Broadcast Network, visit us at www.xzbn.net.
I am back with my guest, David Booher, and we're talking about the Gerry Irwin UFO sighting and possible abduction case. And I think we need to speed things up a tad bit. We're going to run out of time. So the Lorenzens are down there in El Paso at Fort Bliss. They're chatting with him about the possibility of the UFO sighting. And I guess this doesn't follow a normal path. Doesn't he at some point feel a compulsion to go back to Utah?
Yes. Well, here's how it goes. I'll try to keep it brief. He started having trouble not long after he was returned to duty. I think a few days later, he fainted or he collapsed on the base, but he was not out very long, and he seemed to recover without any intervention. Then, 3 weeks after the original incident, he collapsed on a street in downtown El Paso, and he was taken by police or an ambulance to the civilian hospital, and he was still unconscious until the early hours of the morning. And when he awoke, he thought he was right back on February 20th. He had forgotten everything in between. And his first words once again were there any survivors? And shortly after that, they transferred him back to the Army hospital. And this time, they kept him on that ward for 30 days or 32 days.
When you say that ward, what do you mean, that ward?
The psychiatric ward in the Army hospital, the same one he was originally checked into.
Okay. And during that time, was he questioned by anybody at all about what had happened to him?
Well, there is on record, there is in his medical records, there was one sodium amytal interview, which is basically drug-induced hypnotic trance. They call it truth serum, under which they questioned him to see if they could penetrate his amnesia. At the time, when he woke up from the session, he didn't remember anything that had transpired, and they wouldn't share anything with him.
So there's nothing in his record, there's nothing in the medical records or the records that you saw that told him what he might have said under the influence of the drug?
Well, actually, there is an account of what he said in the records that even Gerry had not seen until these records were released, according to his authorization after I contacted him. So he never didn't know until that point what he had said.
What did the record say? What did the record say?
It said that, well, Gerry said that it all started when he was about 3, at the age of 3, he said. And he said that he was not supposed to talk about it, or he was not supposed to remember. He said both of those things.
You say it started. What started?
Well, he didn't specify what started. It was in response to the doctor's questioning about what happened on that night that he couldn't remember when he saw the UFO. So, Gerry further went on to say that if he said anything about it, there would be a big investigation that would have negative consequences. I don't have it right in front of me, but basically that people would get hurt if he was to talk about it. So,
do we have a clue as to what he meant when he can't talk about it? I mean, we're using a lot of pronouns here, and it's not helping us understand what exactly he was talking about.
Well, we don't really have clarity in that regard. But what I do is to compare his statements to what other what people who claim to be abductees have said.
Let me ask you a question. Is he suggesting he was an abductee?
No.
Okay.
Actually, it's important to note that this occurred in 1959. Now, the first stories of alien abduction, as we call it, were not even circulating in the media until mainstream media. Nobody heard of this until the mid-60s. Now, there was one story that was published in English in Brazil in 1961 or 62, but that did not get any attention in the United States. The only people who knew of this phenomenon were UFO researchers.
I was going to say the Lorenzens knew about the Villas-Boas abduction in Brazil in 1957. I think
exactly.
Octavio Fontes had told them about it, and they didn't do much with it because it was really, really strange, meaning he was taking on board a flying saucer.
Right. Now, that's an important detail because they learned about that about a year before Gerry's case, and that was surely influencing how they saw Gerry's case. They themselves didn't publish anything about the Villas-Boas case until the late 60s. They waited.
They waited until after the Hill abduction, and then brought it forward because they thought it was very, very strange. But I mean, the point is, Gerry has not talked about being abducted. He's has no memory of an abduction or anything like this. I think it's important that we point out that he now believed after the amytal, sodium amytal session, he felt a compulsion to go back to Cedar City and take another look around. He had left his jacket out there somewhere, I think, is what the deal was, and he went to bed and left some kind of a note in his jacket, and he went out to retrieve that. Is that correct?
Well, this is an important detail about what happened when he was in the hospital in Cedar City, Utah, and still unconscious. He had been uttering the words "jacket on bush." And when he came to and was asked about that, he didn't know why he was saying that. But he did say that it did remind him about his jacket, and he asked about it. He said, "Where is my jacket?" It was a new jacket that he had underneath his army overcoat. And they said nobody saw any sign of a jacket. And so that was a mystery. What happened to his jacket? And then later on, when he was released from his 32-day stay in the psych ward, mysteriously the next day, he went into a trance and went AWOL, boarding a Greyhound bus back to Utah, an overnight bus. The next day, he gets off in Cedar City, and he walks out about 6 miles away from town and finds his jacket. And there's a stuck to the buttonhole of the jacket and a note wrapped around it. And he takes the pencil out, unrolls the note, and burns it without reading it. And at that moment, when he smells the smoke, he snaps out of his trance. So he doesn't even know what was on the note. But then he realizes he needs to get back to town and turn himself in because he's AWOL.
How long had he been gone at that point from his duty?
At that point, he had been gone about a day and a half.
Okay, so he wouldn't get into a whole lot of trouble for doing that then.
Yeah, and apparently it was not. He was fined, and I think he was busted 1 rank as a result of that.
So he's back to PFC.
Yeah.
Okay. So, but we still have an event that took place. He's kind of out of it. He's not sure what he'd seen. He doesn't believe that there was an abduction, or he was abducted by alien creatures. What does he think happened to him?
Well, that's a good question. He has no idea. As far as he's concerned, he saw the strange object. He went to look for it. He passed out. He woke up in the hospital, and that's all he knows. And but what's so interesting, and then that's, as far as he's concerned, that's the end of the story. And as far as he's concerned, it's not even very interesting. But then it's important to bear in mind that he does not even know much of what happened in the following year. There's so much of his memory seems to have fallen into a black hole.
But it sounds like it's a psychological problem as opposed to something else. I mean, people have those sorts of phases that they go through. Some people do, I should say, where they're just completely lost and they lose part of a year or something like that. It sounds like it's more psychological than anything else.
Well, that's of course a possibility, and there are many possibilities that are explored in the book. Lots of questions, and the short answer to that is that he had no disciplinary problems or medical issues that anybody had noted up until the night when he saw this object. And then for about a year or a year, depending on how you divide it up, about a year, he had lots of trouble. His career went into a tailspin. And there's no real explanation for that. When people have a big psychological crisis, it's usually because there's usually a precipitating event, like a trauma of some kind. So, which raises the question of, well, what kind of trauma did he experience if that's what happened? All he did was start walking towards something he thought was a possible plane crash, and then next thing he knows, he's in the hospital. What happened in between?
So he disappears from the base. He's AWOL for a day and a half, but he doesn't go right back to the base. Where does he go?
Well, he turns himself into the sheriff in Cedar City, and at that point, the sheriff notified his commanding officer, and it was a few days before the MPs picked him up.
Okay, well let's break there, because I'm gonna have to take a quick break here anyway.
Right.
The book is called No Return: a UFO Abduction or Covert Operation. Quickly, you have a Facebook page about this. Give me the Facebook page quickly.
Yeah, it's No Return at Forgotten Encounter.
Okay, and that's on Facebook. I'll try to get a link to it in my blog at www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com, so that those of you who are interested in following up on this, you'll have an opportunity to do so. We will be back right after this with a little bit more information about Gerry Irwin and his events, so stick around.
This is the X-Zone Broadcast Network, broadcasting worldwide on broadcast affiliates and satellite program providers, including CNN Broadcast Network, Sirius Satellite Network, Star Media, Good News Radio Network, Angel Broadcast Network, Wiki Broadcast Network, and WPBN TV. For more information on the X-Zone Broadcast Network, visit us at www.xzbn.net.
Did you know that when you're on the road with limited data or Wi-Fi, you can still listen to the X-Zone Radio Show with Rob McConnell, The Science of Magic with Gwilda Wiyaka, X-1, Dimension X, Space Patrol, and every minute of the X-Zone Broadcast Network by calling 213-401-0080, courtesy of Audio Now. No smartphone, app, or internet needed. It saves your data plan, and it's free if you have unlimited minutes. Call 213-401-0080 to listen on any phone, anytime, anywhere. Remember 213-401-0080 for the best of the paranormal, parapsychology, and sci-fi radio programming anywhere, 24/7, 365.
I am joined by David Booher. We're talking about Gerry Irwin, who had a bizarre experience back in 1959 that may have been UFO related, may have been some kind of a government covert operation, meaning experiments with psychotropic drugs, I guess, something like that. His military career at that point suffered from it, according to his records, and that sort of thing. But I think one of the questions that might be of interest to the audience is, did he ever take a polygraph test about this?
Well, to the best of my knowledge, he did not. There's no indication in his records, his military records, that happened, and no civilian has ever administered a test.
Well, I think it's also important to point out here that the Lorenzens were investigating it in 1959, and they were in contact with Gerry, had set up him to meet with a civilian psychologist or psychiatrist, and he did not make the meeting. Then he sort of dropped out of, I guess, the dropped off the radar of the UFO people, so that he was nobody was really talking about this case. Lorenzens wrote about it in the April Bulletin. I think that they did a book, UFO Occupants, I think in the end of the 1960s, 1970s, somewhere in there, where they talked about the case a little bit, but they had no resolution for it. My question is, how did you discover this case, and how did you get excited about, I mean, not excited, but how did you get started investigating it?
Well, I was rereading one of Jacques Vallée's books, Dimensions, and I had read the book a couple of times in the past, and I came upon, and he has a summary of the story of Gerry Irwin in one of his chapters, and this time around, for some reason, and this is something I can't explain, I was just seized by a powerful curiosity. I just, when I read the end of the summary, which is basically that Gerry disappeared and was never seen again, I just got to thinking, well, what happened to him? People don't just disappear. He had to go somewhere. And I wondered if he was okay. I wondered if he was still alive and if he was still okay at this point. And so I started doing research. I wasn't thinking about a book at first. I just wondered, well, hasn't anybody else looked into this? And as far as I could tell, nobody had. And out FOIA requests, and that didn't really go anywhere. And then I dug up the original newspaper articles, and then I decided to try to see if I could find any living relatives of Gerry's. And in the process, I found Gerry's contact information, which surprised me, but I was able to get a hold of him directly.
What was his reaction to being contacted by somebody doing UFO research? 50 years later?
You know, it's interesting. He was definitely surprised, but it was almost as if he was just waiting for this, because as soon as I brought it up and asked him if he was willing to talk about it, he gave me the whole rundown of what he could remember, which is not, it's basically just the initial incident. That's about all he can remember. But he was quite forthcoming about it.
Is he retired military?
Well, he was discharged in 1966 with an honorable discharge.
Okay, so he was in the service for 7 or 8 years then.
Well, he enlisted in the Air Force in 1953, and he did I believe that was a 4-year enlistment.
Okay.
And then, or maybe well, he had.
Well, the point is he did other things. He did some military service, and then he went off and did something else.
Yes, he was out of the service for about 2 years, and then he re-enlisted, this time in the Army. And then he, I think about a year or so into his Army enlistment, that's when he had the incident. And after it was all said and done, the events that followed that incident, there was about a year and a half before that was kind of all cleared up, and he resumed his regular Army career, and which was 1970 60.
So he had a stint in the military. He did okay after this bizarre incident took place. You had an opportunity to talk to him on several occasions, I assume. You've got his military records and his medical records. Anything in
Yes.
there that gives a hint about what this might have been?
Well, the hints don't come really from Gerry very much because he remembers so very little. We have to get the hints from medical records, from what the Lorenzens recorded about him, and more clues came from file that they kept on him, which contained letters to an attorney. There was actually correspondence between Coral Lorenzen and Carl Jung. Carl Jung was consulted on the case. There was the original handwritten notes they kept. So a lot of tantalizing clues kind of arise from these other sources.
What you're telling me here, what I understand you to say, is there's a lot of documentation available, and you've been able to uncover that documentation, whether it's the notes kept by the Lorenzens, the military record about this, the correspondence between Coral and a number of other people about the case. But Gerry drops off the radar in 1959 and doesn't really resurface until you find him 50 years later.
That's about it. No
And
one
all
had
of this,
talked to him.
all
Yeah,
of this
go
is laid out. All of this is laid out in the book.
Yeah. I pretty much explained the process I went through and how one clue or piece of evidence led to another, and it's pretty interesting how it all unfolded. I never could have guessed when I got started on this what it was going to lead to.
What do you think happened to him?
I think he did encounter something that was truly unexplained. Now, although I still believe it's possible that he encountered something that was perhaps a top secret aircraft that was in development. I think that's a possibility. My hunch is that he saw something that was truly unexplained.
But when we get down to the bottom line, the only person that really saw anything was Gerry Irwin. There were no, I mean, we know what his experiences were afterwards, but we don't know what all was going on with him at that time.
Yeah, exactly. Now, the case that I make in the book, I think it's pretty clear that Gerry was according to all his service records, at first he was a reliable airman, and he received medals of good conduct and whatnot while he was serving in that capacity. And then later on, when he joined the Army, he became a Nike missile technician. There were no disciplinary problems of any kind. He was getting very high marks for his service. And then suddenly this thing happens, and he goes into a tailspin. When it's all said and done, and he re-enters his regular service, he rises up to the rank of sergeant, and he gets apparently some kind of undercover assignment in Austria. And
well, I hate to break in here, but we're out of time. I'm going to have to.
Okay.
We're going to have to wrap it up there. If you want more information about what happened to Gerry and where he went afterwards, the book is No Return: UFO Abduction and Covert Operations, available at Amazon, I assume, through Anomalous Books.
yes.
And the Facebook page, once again, for those who would be interested in looking at that.
No Return at Forgotten Encounter.
Okay. Thanks for your time. I appreciate you chatting with us here.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for having me on.
Okay. Glad to do it because we have to get the information out there somehow, I suppose. Um, for those of you interested, next week I will have Francis Ridge on. He is running the NICAP website now, which is quite extensive and a wonderful resource for those who are interested in it. More information about this, and with any luck at all, I'll get the Facebook link up as well for no return at www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com. And after Fran Ridge next week, the week after that, we'll have Ben Moss. We'll be talking about the Socorro case, which is just my excuse for promoting the book Encounter in the Desert, which is my take on the Lonnie Zamora case that took place in 1964 and what Lonnie Zamora saw and what I was able to learn, some interesting new facts about that case in my investigation of it after Ben Moss kind of inspired my interest in it when I had him on the program last year. Take a look at the other fine programs at the X Zone Broadcast Network.